November 12, 1944, somewhere in the Ardennes, Belgium, the air was thick with smoke, acrid and choking, curling around the crumbling ruins of what had once been a quiet village. Every breath burned his lungs, and the stench of gunpowder mixed with the coppery scent of blood clung to the mud-soaked trenches. Explosions tore the sky apart in deafening rumbles, each blast throwing shards of earth into the air like jagged missiles. Somewhere in the distance, a scream cut through the chaos sharp, human. Unforgettable. Private Thomas Reilly pressed himself against the muddy embankment, his uniform soaked and his hands trembling as he gripped his rifle. He was an ordinary man, just 22, thrust into extraordinary circumstances. His eyes scanned the battlefield, searching for movement through the haze of smoke and rain. Enemy soldiers advanced relentlessly, their boots splashing through the mire, eyes cold with determination. Reilly's heart pounded like a war drum, echoing the artillery overhead. Reinforcements were nowhere in sight, and every second felt like a lifetime. He could see the devastation all around him. The once vibrant village square was nothing more than splintered wood and rubble. Cries of the wounded mingled with the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire, creating a symphony of terror that seemed endless. Reilly's stomach churned as he ducked under the fragments of a collapsing wall. A fellow soldier, barely recognizable beneath the mud and grime, clutched his leg, moaning as the enemy closed in. Reilly's mind raced, calculating every possible move, every escape, every desperate chance at survival. Amid the chaos, something inside him shifted. Panic threatened to paralyze him, but he forced it down. Survival wasn't just about shooting straight. It was about thinking faster, improvising, using every scrap of advantage the battlefield offered. He noticed the remnants of a supply crate smashed and broken lying near a shell crater. Bits of metal, rope, and what looked like an unexploded grenade littered the ground. A spark of possibility ignited in his mind, a dangerous, desperate idea. Born from sheer necessity, the enemy was closing in faster now, their silhouettes sharp against the gray smoke. Reilly's comrades were pinned down, unable to move, their shouts lost in the thunder of artillery. The mud sucked at his boots as he crawled forward, heart hammering in his chest, every instinct screaming that he had no time. A shell landed too close, shaking the ground beneath him, throwing dirt and debris over his back. He pressed himself flat, staring into the eyes of the approaching soldiers, counting them 20, maybe more. The odds were impossible. Yet a strange clarity settled over him. Reilly's fingers brushed against something that could change everything. Improvised or not, it was his only chance. The thought was terrifying. An ordinary man, using ordinary materials, to face extraordinary danger. But in this moment, fear transformed into focus. Every ounce of his training, every instinct honed in boot camp, funneled into the single idea of survival and, if possible, turning the tide against the enemy. He paused for a fraction of a second, listening to the screams, the crack of rifles, the relentless pounding of artillery. Around him, the world was collapsing, yet in that chaos, a plan began to take shape, bold, dangerous, and entirely unconventional. One misstep, and it would mean instant death. One success, and maybe, just maybe, he could shift the balance of the battle. The rain-slicked mud beneath him was cold and unforgiving. The enemy soldiers drew nearer, their voices sharp, carrying orders through the smoke-filled air. Reilly's hand hovered over the makeshift weapon he had spotted, heart racing, mind calculating every risk. He was about to do something no one would expect, something that could change everything in this hellish front line, and in that instant, amid the roar of artillery and the cries of the wounded, the ordinary soldier understood that survival demanded not just courage, but invention. One desperate, improvised act could make the difference between life and death, not just for him, but for everyone pinned down behind the shattered remnants of the village. The forest had once been a place of quiet serenity, its tall pines swaying gently in the wind. Now it was a death trap. Smoke curled through the trees like ghostly fingers, and every step Reilly took sank into the muddy, shell-pocked earth. Shadows flickered between the trunks, betraying the movements of enemy troops converging from every angle. The ambush had been sudden, ruthless, and perfectly executed. Reilly crouched low, heart hammering as he watched his unit struggle to hold the line. Men he had trained with for months or years were falling, one after another, swallowed by gunfire and explosions. A mortar round landed nearby, throwing splintered wood and mud into the air. The smell of burnt powder stung his nose, and he wiped sweat and grime from his eyes, trying to see through the haze. Fall back. Fall back. Someone screamed, panic creeping into the command. But there was nowhere to retreat. Trees had turned into obstacles, the forest floor was torn by craters, and the enemy pressed forward with frightening precision. Reilly's hand shook as he reloaded his rifle for the third time, each bullet seeming more precious than the last. He realized with cold clarity that conventional weapons alone were no longer enough. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and isolated. A glance to his left revealed Corporal Matthews pinned under the fallen branches of a shattered tree, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle. The man groaned, clutching his stomach, blood soaking his uniform. Reilly's stomach knotted. He wanted to help, to drag him to safety, but there were too many of them, too many eyes, too many rifles trained in their direction. Survival demanded decisions that would haunt him forever. He ducked behind a broken stump, listening intently. Every step, every snapped twig could mean death. Through the smoke, he counted the enemy soldiers advancing in small, relentless waves. 20, 30, maybe more. Their rifles glinted in the weak sunlight that filtered through the pines, and their disciplined movement left no room for error. Reilly felt the oppressive weight of fear pressing down on him, but he refused to let it paralyze him. Fear, he reminded himself, was a luxury he could not afford. A sudden volley of gunfire ripped through the forest, sending dirt and leaves spraying around him. One of his comrades, Private Jenkins, fell face first into the mud, twitching violently. Reilly's heart clenched. The forest was alive with the screams of the wounded, the orders shouted over the gunfire, and the deafening roar of artillery overhead. Every sense screamed that the situation was hopeless. Yet deep in his mind, a small ember of determination flickered. Survival meant thinking beyond what was taught in training. It meant improvisation. It meant courage of a different kind. Reilly scanned the ground, eyes darting over the scattered remnants of supplies, abandoned packs, and broken equipment. His mind raced. If conventional rifles weren't enough, what could turn the tide? He noticed fragments of metal, ropes, and a few unexploded grenades discarded by retreating soldiers. A dangerous, desperate thought crept into his mind. Maybe he could use them not in the way the manuals suggested, but in a way no one would anticipate. The enemy was closing faster now. Their shouts echoed between the trees, their footsteps crunching over the frozen, mud-soaked ground. Reilly could see their eyes, calculating, cold, and unyielding. His comrades were struggling to regroup, their morale waning with each passing second. Ammunition was low, and for every shot fired, the odds seemed to shift further against them. Panic bubbled at the edges of Reilly's mind, but he forced it down. There was no time for hesitation. He ducked behind another tree as bullets shredded the earth inches from his head. His fingers brushed against a jagged piece of metal from a shattered crate, and the pieces of his plan began to form. Improvised or not, it was their only chance. Reilly's mind worked faster than it had ever worked before, calculating angles, timing, and distance. One wrong move, and it would mean instant death. One clever move, and they might survive this nightmare. Every muscle in his body screamed with exhaustion. Mud clung to his uniform, sweat mingled with blood on his face, and the roar of battle threatened to overwhelm his senses. Yet, amid the chaos, clarity emerged. Survival demanded innovation, audacity, and a willingness to take risks that would terrify any ordinary man. Reilly's heart pounded not just with fear, but with the possibility of turning desperation into power, and as he pressed himself into the cold earth, listening to the relentless advance of enemy boots and the cries of his fallen comrades, he realized that ordinary weapons would not save them. Only an extraordinary improvised solution could. His fingers tightened around the fragments at his feet, mind racing with the dangerous plan that could change everything, if he could summon the courage to act. The forest seemed endless, a labyrinth of shattered trees and churned earth, and the smoke hung low, thick enough to taste. Reilly crawled forward, mud clinging to his uniform, heart hammering, ears ringing from the constant roar of artillery and gunfire. Around him, the world was chaos incarnate, fallen comrades, abandoned rifles, and the lifeless bodies of enemy soldiers frozen mid-stride. Yet even in the destruction, he knew what had to be done. Ordinary weapons would no longer suffice. If they were to survive, he would have to create something extraordinary. He slid behind a shattered supply crate, chest heaving, fingers trembling. Scattered across the ground were remnants of a supply drop grenade fragments, lengths of wire, scraps of metal, even a few unexploded munitions that had been discarded in the frenzy. Reilly's mind raced, calculating the impossible. Could he turn these scraps into a weapon that might stop the enemy's relentless advance? Every second mattered. Every sound, the snap of a branch, the distant shout of a soldier, the hiss of a bullet reminded him that hesitation would be fatal. Reilly's fingers moved quickly but carefully, testing the materials, fitting pieces together with the precision of a craftsman under fire. He worked silently, aware that one wrong sound could give him away. He stripped wires from a shattered radio, tightened a spring salvage from a broken rifle, and positioned a grenade fragment within the crude assembly. Sweat stung his eyes, mixing with dirt and blood as he labored, and his mind teetered between fear and determination. He paused for a moment, surveying the battlefield through the haze. Enemy soldiers were advancing in small waves, moving around the shell craters and broken trees with frightening discipline. He could see the desperation in his comrades, the exhausted men who had managed to survive this far, their faces pale, weapons trembling in their hands. He thought of the ones who had fallen, of the screams that still haunted his ears. He thought of Corporal Matthews, pinned under debris, his groans echoing faintly through the smoke. Failure was not an option, not if even one of them was to survive. Reilly returned to his work, assembling the improvised weapon with a mix of fear and resolve. His hands shook as he connected the final wire, testing the mechanism as silently as he could. Every movement had to be precise. Every calculation mattered. One misstep could mean instant death for him or, worse, for everyone around him. And yet, with every piece in place, a spark of hope flickered in his chest. Maybe, just maybe, this could work. Time slowed, the forest around him simultaneously alive and frozen. A distant explosion shook the ground, throwing debris into the air and knocking him against the mud. He pressed himself flat, heart racing, as bullets ricocheted nearby, kicking up splinters and dirt. In that chaos, he understood something fundamental. Ingenuity could turn fear into power. The ordinary scraps of metal, wire, and explosives in front of him could become a force strong enough to level the odds. He had the courage to act. He visualized the plan in his mind, set the improvised device at the center of the enemy's advance, lure them into a confined area, and detonate it at precisely the right moment. The calculations were simple in theory, impossible in practice. Any miscalculation would mean death. Yet, even as the terror gnawed at him, determination hardened his resolve. This was not just about survival, it was about protecting his comrades, about defying the overwhelming tide of enemy forces that threatened to crush them. Reilly's hands moved with deliberate speed, connecting the final components. He tested the trigger mechanism, holding his breath as it clicked into place. Silence surrounded him, broken only by the distant cries of battle and the relentless pounding of artillery. He could feel the tension in every muscle, every nerve. The improvised weapon was complete. In that moment, hope and fear coexisted in equal measure, a fragile balance on the edge of disaster. He took a deep breath, eyes scanning the smoke-filled forest one last time. The enemy soldiers were approaching faster now, their numbers overwhelming, their discipline terrifying. The forest was a maze, but the weapon in his hands could transform it into a trap. He knew that once he acted, there would be no turning back. One misstep, one delay, and all would be lost. But for the first time in hours, a small, dangerous glimmer of control sparked in his chest. Reilly adjusted the device, crouching low behind the cover of a broken tree. Every detail mattered: the angle, the timing, the placement. The fate of his unit rested entirely on this desperate act of invention. And as the sounds of the enemy grew louder, as the shadows of approaching soldiers stretched long across the mud and smoke, he understood that his ingenuity might be the only thing standing between life and death. The forest had grown darker, shadows stretching long beneath the skeletal trees, and the smoke had thickened into a choking haze that clung to Reilly's uniform. He pressed himself flat against the muddy ground, eyes scanning the battlefield, pulse hammering. The improvised device rested carefully beside him, its cold metal components a dangerous promise of hope. Every step forward now could mean life or death, not just for him, but for the few comrades still clinging to survival. Reilly waited, listening. The distant shuffle of enemy boots, the low murmur of commands, the occasional snap of a branch underfoot, they were all signs that the soldiers were moving closer, methodical, relentless. He knew he had only one chance. One misstep, and he would be torn apart before he could even deploy the device. Yet fear sharpened his senses rather than dulled them. Each heartbeat was a metronome, each breath a calculated measure of time. Guiding his movements through the smoke and mud, he inched forward, hand over hand, using the remnants of a collapsed wall as cover. Every step was agonizingly slow, the mud sucking at his boots, the weight of the weapon at his side pressing down on his back. He passed the bodies of the fallen, some friends, some enemies frozen in moments of terror and disbelief. The smell of blood and burnt powder was overpowering, but he forced himself to focus, suppressing nausea. The forest seemed to close around him, alive with threat, and yet he pressed on. A sudden crack, the sound of a branch snapping under the boot of an enemy soldier, made him freeze. Breath caught in his throat. For a moment he was certain they had seen him. The shadow of a rifle glinted just meters away, and time slowed. Reilly pressed himself flat against the ground, heart hammering so violently he feared it would give him away. The soldier passed without noticing him, and Reilly exhaled silently, muscles trembling with relief and tension alike. One mistake could have ended everything. He moved again, crawling across the shattered earth toward a shallow depression in the forest floor, a natural trap he had identified during his initial survey. This was where the device would have maximum effect, where the enemy soldiers would funnel themselves unknowingly into danger. He paused, glancing at the few remaining comrades huddled behind makeshift cover. Their eyes met his briefly, a silent exchange of hope and desperation. He gave a slight nod, almost imperceptible, then turned back to the task at hand. Every step now was a negotiation with death. The enemy patrols were so close he could hear the hiss of breath, the faint clatter of gear against uniform. One miscalculation, one wrong angle, and he would be discovered. He placed the device carefully, adjusting its angle, making sure the trigger mechanism was hidden from sight but ready to activate at the exact moment. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with mud, yet his hands moved with meticulous precision. Fear was present, but it was a focused, purposeful fear, the kind that sharpens every sense. He retreated a few meters, flattening himself behind a fallen tree as he counted the enemy soldiers in the clearing ahead. 20, maybe more. Their formation was tight, but not perfect. Each man's position, each footstep, each subtle pause had been memorized by Reilly in the minutes leading up to this moment. He calculated timing, imagining the blast, imagining the chaos that would follow. For the first time since the ambush, he felt a flicker of control. A sudden shout broke through the smoke. One soldier had noticed movement, turning his head in Reilly's direction. Time slowed again. Reilly's muscles tensed, every nerve screaming to hold still. Then, as if fate had granted him a reprieve, the enemy soldier's gaze drifted, distracted by a sound behind him. Reilly exhaled, barely audible, and shifted slightly, inching closer to the trigger mechanism. One final adjustment. One final breath. The device was ready. The forest seemed to hold its breath alongside him, the wind pausing, the distant gunfire momentarily fading in his ears. He could feel the adrenaline pumping through his veins, sharpening every sense, heightening every instinct. He was a single man, alone in the smoke and mud, standing on the edge of survival and catastrophe. One move would change everything. Reilly pressed his finger against the trigger, muscles trembling, mind focused with lethal clarity. The forest, the soldiers, the screams, the smoke, all of it faded into the singular moment of possibility. And in that heartbeat he understood that courage was not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. Reilly's finger hovered over the trigger, heart hammering like a drum, ears straining to catch every sound. The forest was deceptively quiet in the moments before disaster. The distant artillery muted. The enemy soldiers' movements slowed in their oblivious advance. Time felt elastic, stretching and compressing as adrenaline coursed through his veins. One miscalculation, one hesitation, and the opportunity would be lost forever. He exhaled slowly, pressing the trigger. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a violent, ear-splitting explosion shattered the forest. Mud, splintered wood, and debris were hurled into the air as the improvised device erupted with terrifying force. The enemy soldiers in the clearing were caught completely off guard. Their shouts of alarm cut short by the roar of destruction. Reilly was thrown to the ground by the shockwave, ears ringing, vision blurred by smoke and flying debris. When he lifted his head, the aftermath was both horrific and awe-inspiring. Bodies were scattered, some thrown against trees, others crumpled in the mud. The once ordered advance of the enemy was now chaos incarnate. The clearing was filled with screams, groans, and the harsh metallic smell of blood. Every soldier who had been in the path of the device was either incapacitated or dead. 20 lives extinguished in a single, desperate act. For a moment, Reilly could do nothing but stare. Chest heaving, mud clinging to his uniform, eyes wide with shock and disbelief. The forest around him seemed almost unreal, suspended in the wake of the explosion. Smoke curled through the trees like a living thing, carrying with it the cries of the wounded and the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood. The magnitude of what he had done, the lives taken, the destruction wrought settled over him like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Yet amidst the horror, a strange clarity emerged. His comrades, those who had survived the ambush, began cautiously moving toward him, faces pale but eyes alive with astonishment and relief. He saw Corporal Matthews, still pinned under debris, but alive, waving weakly at him. Private Jenkins crawled over, clutching his side, muttering a shaky, "You did it." Reilly's hands shook uncontrollably. The weight of what he had just accomplished pressing down like a physical force. The enemy was in disarray, retreating through the shattered forest, their discipline broken, their advance halted. Reilly realized that in this single improvised act he had turned the tide of the battle. His ordinary tools, combined with extraordinary courage, had created a moment that could change everything. And yet the victory was bitter. Each life lost, even enemy soldiers, etched itself into his mind with cruel clarity. The exhilaration of survival was inseparable from the horror of what he had wrought. He moved carefully through the smoke, helping wounded comrades where he could, checking the perimeter to ensure no immediate threats remained. The forest was eerily silent now, the only sounds the shallow breaths of survivors and the distant echo of retreating enemy forces. Reilly's hands were sticky with mud and blood, his uniform torn and filthy, yet he felt a strange, sobering pride. He had acted when it mattered most, when fear threatened to paralyze him. And through ingenuity and audacity, he had saved the lives of those still with him. But even as relief began to creep in, Reilly could not escape the emotional weight of the moment. Each body in the clearing, each scream cut short, reminded him that survival came at a cost. He forced himself to breathe, to move, to focus on the living, even as the dead lay frozen in the aftermath of his desperate gamble. The explosion had changed everything. The ambush was over, the immediate threat neutralized. But the psychological toll was only beginning to settle in. Reilly crouched against a fallen tree, hands on his knees, staring at the devastation. In the midst of chaos, he had found a way to fight back, to reclaim a sliver of control in a war that seemed overwhelming. The forest, once a trap, had become a testament to his courage and ingenuity. But the price of that moment, the lives taken, the terror witnessed, would linger in his mind forever, and as the distant rumble of artillery resumed, Reilly understood the brutal truth of war. Survival was not simply about courage. It was about creativity, audacity, and the willingness to do what others could not. One soldier's desperate act of improvisation had killed 20, shattered an enemy advance, and preserved the lives of those he fought alongside, but it had also marked him indelibly, leaving a shadow of both triumph and horror over everything that remained. The forest was quiet now, almost unnaturally, so smoke still curled among the shattered trees, carrying the acrid tang of gunpowder and the coppery scent of blood. The distant echoes of artillery had faded, replaced by an eerie hush, broken only by the shallow breaths of the surviving soldiers. Reilly lay against a fallen tree, chest heaving, hands trembling, eyes wide as he took in the aftermath of the explosion. 20 enemy soldiers were dead, dozens more had fled in disarray. And yet, in the silence that followed, the true weight of what had happened settled over him, around him. Comrades emerged cautiously from their cover, mud-streaked and exhausted. Corporal Matthews struggled to his feet, wincing as he adjusted his injured arm. You saved us," he muttered, voice shaking with disbelief and gratitude. Private Jenkins, clutching a grazed side, offered a weak but sincere nod. Every glance Reilly received carried the same mixture of astonishment, relief, and unspoken recognition. He had changed the course of their survival. Yet the faces of those he helped did little to quiet the gnawing unease in his chest. Reilly rose slowly, testing his legs, feeling the mud and blood caked into his uniform. The forest floor was littered with the aftermath of the battle, broken rifles, scattered gear, and the bodies of both friend and foe alike. Each fallen figure was a stark reminder that victory in this war came at an unspeakable cost. Relief mingled with guilt, adrenaline giving way to exhaustion and the creeping realization of what he had done. Survival had required ingenuity, but it had demanded the taking of lives. And the echoes of those deaths reverberated in his mind. The survivors began to gather their wounded, moving methodically, each action a testament to discipline and sheer willpower. Reilly assisted where he could, tying makeshift bandages, helping to lift the injured, his hands sticky with blood and mud. Amid the quiet, the men shared tentative glances, unspoken communication passing between them. They knew that Reilly's courage and ingenuity had preserved their lives. Yet the forest seemed to demand acknowledgement of the cost. The faces of the fallen, frozen in moments of shock, were impossible to ignore. A low murmur ran through the small group as they took stock of what remained. Ammunition was critically low, supplies scattered, and the forest remained hostile, yet there was a fragile sense of relief. The enemy's advance had been halted, the immediate threat neutralized, and their survival against overwhelming odds was undeniable. Reilly's mind raced, not with strategy this time, but with the heavy burden of reflection. Each life saved was inseparable from the 20 he had taken, and the dichotomy weighed on him like a stone. The forest remained still as Reilly's thoughts returned to the improvised device, the weapon that had turned chaos into survival. The idea had been born of desperation, executed with meticulous precision, and had succeeded beyond what even he had dared to hope. Yet he could not escape the moral gravity of the act. He had killed 20 men, each with a family, a history, a life abruptly ended. In the silence of the aftermath, that truth was unavoidable. Survival was not clean, not noble, but it was real. And the cost was carried in every breath he took. A distant figure approached through the smoke, a sergeant from another unit who had arrived just after the explosion. His expression was a mixture of awe and concern. "Reilly, you did what no one else could," he said quietly, surveying the battlefield. "You saved the unit, but this will follow you. Remember that." Reilly nodded, unable to speak, the words heavy on his tongue. The recognition was tempered by the knowledge that the weight of the action would linger long after the battle was over. As darkness began to fall, the survivors huddled together, exhausted, trembling from adrenaline and relief. Fires were cautiously lit, food and water distributed where possible, and watch was maintained. Reilly found a small clearing, sitting against a tree, staring into the blackened forest, trying to reconcile the horror he had witnessed with the necessity of what he had done. Around him the men murmured quietly, some weeping softly, others in silent prayer. The night held a fragile calm, but the memories of the day, the screams, the chaos, the improvised weapon would not let him rest. In that quiet, Reilly understood the paradox of war. Survival demanded courage, ingenuity, and action, but those same qualities carried with them the weight of conscience. He had acted decisively, saved lives, and changed the course of the battle. Yet the ghosts of the fallen lingered, reminders that every victory bore a hidden cost. As he closed his eyes for the first time in hours, exhaustion overtaking him, he felt the crushing truth settle fully. War was never clean, and survival never free of consequence. The forest was quiet in the early light, mist curling between the skeletal trees. Smoke from yesterday's battle had dissipated, leaving behind a scorched earth that bore silent witness to the chaos and devastation. Reilly sat against a tree, uniform torn, mud crusted on his hands and face, eyes scanning the clearing where the enemy had fallen. The forest was still, but in its silence lingered the memory of screams, explosions, and the desperate courage that had turned the tide. Word of his actions had already begun to spread among the men. His comrades, exhausted but alive, moved through the forest with a quiet reverence when they passed him. Corporal Matthews, now bandaged and leaning heavily on a makeshift crutch, caught his eye and gave the slightest nod of acknowledgement. No words were needed. The simple act of survival, the ingenuity that had transformed scraps of metal and wire into a weapon capable of halting an enemy advance, had made him something more than a soldier. He had become a legend among his unit, a quiet hero forged from desperation and courage. Yet, even as respect and admiration surrounded him, Reilly could not shake the weight of the human cost. The lives lost, 20 enemy soldiers, the comrades who had fallen before the explosion haunted every thought. He had saved lives, yes, but he had also taken them, a bitter paradox that war imposed with relentless cruelty. Survival was never clean. Heroism was never without its shadows. Each victory carried a cost, each act of ingenuity a moral weight that no medal or acknowledgement could ever erase. The men moved cautiously through the remnants of the battlefield, gathering supplies, tending to the wounded, and marking positions. Reilly's improvised weapon had changed the course of the engagement, but the forest itself seemed to whisper the price of such ingenuity. The broken trees, the mud-soaked craters, the silence of the fallen they were reminders that courage in war was inseparable from horror. One act of brilliance, one spark of desperate invention, could save lives and destroy others in the same heartbeat. As he stood and began to move with the others, Reilly reflected on what had been required of him. Fear had been constant, but so had determination. His mind had worked faster than his body, calculating angles, timing, and the unimaginable risks of deploying the device. Courage had been more than a feeling. It had been a calculated, deliberate act born from necessity. And in that delicate balance between life and death, he had discovered the thin line between heroism and horror, a line he would carry with him for the rest of his life. The sun began to pierce the mist, casting long, golden beams across the forest floor. Reilly paused to watch, letting the moment of fragile calm settle around him. He understood that history would not remember every quiet hero, every desperate act of ingenuity that preserved life amid chaos. But in the hearts and minds of those he had saved, his actions would endure, a story passed quietly in whispers, a testament to the extraordinary courage of an ordinary man. And as the forest slowly came alive with the sounds of movement and cautious optimism, Reilly realized something profound. Survival in war was never simply about strength or numbers. It was about thinking beyond fear, acting beyond instinct, and embracing ingenuity when all else had failed. One soldier, with nothing but scraps of metal, wire, and determination, had altered the course of a battle. One desperate improvisational act had saved lives, shaped destinies, and left an indelible mark on all who witnessed it. In that realization, he found both solace and sorrow. The war would continue, the horrors would persist, But in that small clearing of the Ardennes, an ordinary man had become a legend. And the forest, silent yet watchful, seemed to hold its breath, acknowledging the price of courage, the weight of ingenuity, and the fragile, fleeting balance between life and death.